Hi everyone, welcome to the Palladium podcast. I'm Ash Milton, managing editor at Palladium magazine. Today we're talking with Nicolas Villarreal, who we just call Nico, and we're going to be talking about his piece in Palladium 5. So, as I'm sure many of you are aware, Palladium publishes a quarterly print edition. That print edition is an anthology of our best work on the topic for that quarter. And so for Palladium 5, we're looking at the idea of the centralized society. If you're interested in signing up to receive those print issues, you can see those, or you can sign up rather, at palladiummag.com/subscribe. So these issues come out 4 times a year. They include custom art, an anthology of new and old work, of our best work on the given topic. Actually, I'll rephrase that. They include an anthology of original pieces and some favorites that we've seen before. And we combine those with high-quality materials, with original art, and we usually have launch parties in San Francisco and other cities. So if you're interested in all those things, again, sign up, palladiummag.com/subscribe for more information. So, Nico, your piece in Palladium 5 was titled, and for listeners, this is on the site as well, How Capitalist Giants Use Socialist Cybernetic Planning. So people can see that on the site, they can see it in the print. Maybe before we start, just introduce yourself a bit. Tell us what you do and what perspective you're coming at this from.
All right, so I am a writer and an analyst. I work for a government contractor. And I've also worked a little bit in government in banking regulation. But I am very interested in these cybernetics, especially. I was originally interested in it because of its role in socialist history and in attempts to try to reform the Soviet Union, and also with the experiments that went on in Chile. And I really wanted to, and I also saw these kinds of systems. I should back up and say that I've also been very obsessed with supply chains and logistics, and I think that logistics is basically what runs the world, and we need to hone in on these things more and understand how they work, because this is how, like, what makes everything tick. So these systems of what I talk about in the article is the relationship between systems that were experimented with by socialists in Chile and the systems that are used now by cutting-edge, very large capitalist logistic firms like Amazon, like Walmart, that have to tackle some very fundamental issues about how to get information up and down the supply chain in order to meet demand.
So yeah, this is obviously the interesting aspect of this piece. This continuity between maybe a certain kind of structural logic that both socialists and people in the Western capitalist business world were looking at in this period. Cybersyn, some of these first experiments were done by socialists, but as we'll see, they've actually impacted our society a lot. Obviously, we're not the first ones to see some interesting convergences between the two sides of the Cold War. You have people like Kojev. You have a lot of people who've noted this before, that in a lot of ways, the Soviet Union and America, these two huge, great powers of the 20th century, actually end up rhyming in a lot of ways in what they're attempting to do, maybe especially in the earlier period. I think, we're not going to review the whole piece here because obviously people can read it for themselves. But I think for people listening to this who haven't read the piece, let's just maybe clarify, what was Project Cybersyn?
Right. So Project Cybersyn was an attempt by Chile's socialist government in the 70s to create a planned economy, but while avoiding the kind of really top-down command structure, very top-heavy structure of the Soviet system, and produce something that could really effectively meet people's needs and be efficient. And they did this by using I mean, Chile is still a developing country at the time and did not have access to a lot of big, very useful computers. They ended up having to use this equipment that is more like a glorified fax machine to set up an information network across the country that would transmit information about factories and orders and to coordinate logistics and move goods back and forth. And this became very useful during a trucker strike that was organized. I mean, at the time, truckers were mostly like owner operated, and they had like their own political power in guilds and stuff like that, and were very opposed to the socialist government. And so with so much of the fleet occupied, like not being able to be used, the government was able to use Cybersyn to coordinate production and get around it, which if they didn't have this, the government might very well have been toppled at the time.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, there's the idea behind the system is obviously, you know, as a socialist government, they're interested in this idea of economic planning. But at this point, right, this is the 70s, the early 70s, people have seen the problems with the Soviet model of planning, maybe even with the Chinese model of planning to an extent. And there's this awareness for people in socialist movements that if you're going to do central planning, those approaches to it are not going to work. And so the obvious conclusions of that seem to be, first, you need to actually make the economy fairly legible to to the state and to committees, maybe even on lower levels, and you need to have information flow freely in that economy. So, you know, I think about this in relation to like the Russian model, or you know, Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and obviously you constantly hear these descriptions of massive amounts of waste, of labor time, of resources. People aren't talking to each other. Factory managers are hiding information or are basically basing the decisions about how to do production on these sort of political incentives instead of actually, you know, what's needed, or there's shortages in goods and resources. There's basically a huge amount of chaos in those systems. Things don't align well, and the result is that, you know, after you have this big dramatic catch up and modernization, then you have stagnation, and obviously America at this point is starting to really just decisively outcompete the Soviet Union in production, especially for you know, consumer and commercial goods. So that's like the context here. That's the context behind Cybersyn. But you know, with the logic of computation here, right? So as you sort of describe in the piece, you have Beer and Flores, you know, this cyberneticist from I think he had lived in Canada. I forget what country he's from. British cyberneticist. He's working with contacts in the Chilean government, and their ambition here is that they can kind of create this system which will allow them to do economic planning. And as you pointed out, it sort of seems to work in the trucker strike. Obviously, this thing is never fully implemented, and you know, it has these problems with the kind of hardware it's using. What's the ultimate fate of Cybersyn?
It was destroyed by Pinochet after he took control in a coup that killed Allende, the leader at the time. So we never got to see what would happen to it. There was so much potential, and that's kind of why it is so mythologized in socialist circles today.
Right. You can kind of you can read onto it, you know, what might have been if only it hadn't been destroyed.
Right. But I think there was real potential there, and I think the experience that Western capitalism has had since then speaks to what that potential is in like companies like Amazon and Walmart. But even as I've been researching more about like the American defense industry, they've had to implement these kinds of systems too, in its own, like in the internal organic, what they call the organic industrial base, which is like the part of the industry that's run by the government that handles repairs and ammunition and that kind of stuff.
Right. So maybe let's just describe what's going on here at the top, more of a top level, right? You're mentioning Walmart, Amazon. Cybersyn is destroyed. The sort of whatever socialist computing would have been is short-stopped by the end of the Cold War. But there's this interesting logic that survives, and that permeates our society today. Just describe that a bit. Like, what phenomenon are we talking about?
So we're basically talking about how this use of cybernetic electronic feedback loops that are used to get around what we call the bullwhip problem in supply chains. So when in a traditional market, when you have a change in demand, that demand, the information of that, the price information, the demand information, is experienced directly by the final good seller. And then the final good seller puts in their orders to whoever was supplying them with that, and then it goes down the supply chain to the parts, the raw materials, and so on. So the information about like how demand has changed has to go through all of these institutions in order, and that takes time if it's just going through the market, and they have to the adjustment to that, like it's not, because it's not simultaneous, causes all kinds of delays and problems. And that's really what we are experiencing right now in COVID, is largely the inability to adjust supply chains quickly enough to meet the changes in demand. And cybernetic planning is kind of a way to get around this, because the information about at the supply end of the manufacturing end and the logistics and the final demand end is all being simultaneously recorded and distributed across the supply chain to decision makers.
So, yeah, the problem that is, that this logic tries to solve is how in an industrial system where you have mass production, where you have super complex logistics that you're taking care of, how do you actually make it responsive to disruption or to chaos? How do you make it more resilient as a system? I'm interested to hear first, like, obviously we see a more developed form of this today, like just obviously with the basic application of digital technology in logistical systems, but we also see it in terms of, how you discipline workers in a system like that. You kind of see this weird pattern, this focus on automation to the point where people, a lot of companies, I think, will pretend that these systems are more automated than they are. There's this incentive, like, hide the human element, which maybe we can talk about a bit. I'm interested to hear, like, what's the driving force of that overall logic? Like, is it just this decision made on the interests of people running companies, or do you think that there's this inherent logic here that an advanced industrial society basically has to converge on one way or another?
I think that the automation aspect, to the extent that like you care about efficient, in general, yes, you will see this convergence towards automation, that kind of stuff. I think that the undermining of that trend by, like, hiding the human in there, I think that that's a logical. I mean, on the first part, humans, if you're just building a system to be as efficient as possible for, and you don't have input from workers, that's going to be the natural end point, because it's a lot of these systems, and you see this in Amazon especially, that the automation systems it creates are not made with workers in mind. That it's why so many people have injuries on the jobs and stuff, because they're made to work at the tempo of these mechanical systems. There is another aspect to that of, like, selling this marvelous product, but I think that ultimately the suppression of labor has been a very necessary part of capitalism for quite some time now, since neoliberalism. I mean, it's always been there. It was there was a compromise made in the social democratic era, but what really happens, and this is something that I think I mentioned earlier with the unionization of Amazon before the podcast, that like this is kind of coming to a contradiction because we're finally seeing the return of these really rationalized systems with like these cybernetic giants that I talk about in the article, and these are like really get going in the 90s and have really taken on their own in the past 10 years or so, and they have increased efficiency by kind of returning to this Fordist framework, which is like having workers act in a very mechanical way in centralized production in like warehouses and so on, or distribution centers. And this has facilitated like one, really great efficiency gains, but also a new kind of set of conditions, in my opinion, for worker organization. And this is a contradiction that's playing out right now as Amazon's been unionized.
Right. So I want to talk about that in a moment. Yes. I just want to kind of focus a little longer on this question of the actual logic itself, right? So right. Like we think about the Amazon warehouse or the FedEx processing center, operations like this, as you pointed out, they're using scale. And it seems like, what else is the focus here? What else are they trying to optimize for? It's like minimization of error, being able to track goods and being able to predict, things like arrival times, being able to predict how long each part of the process takes. And in order to achieve that, what you need is standardization and homogenization. And you basically don't care so much about redundancy in the system or about the fragility of the system. You basically want to make sure that things are tracked and that scale is being used as much as possible to cut down the costs of this overall structure. You obviously you can imagine other systems, like other logics in other circumstances. So if you were in a war, obviously you're also going to be concerned about resiliency and redundancy in the system. You're going to be concerned about different parts of a chain of operations being somewhat autonomous from each other. So if one gets destroyed, another, the other parts surviving can keep going. You could care a lot about being able to set up the systems quickly and take them down, right? So like that can happen in war, that can happen in expeditions, research expeditions. You could even imagine a system where the focus is sort of artisanal control over different parts of the structure. And obviously at that point, we're kind of getting out of the sort of industrial logic as we know it. But I just give those examples because, the particular focus on scale and tracking and legibility that this system has is not the only version of this. And that being so I'm kind of interested, given that both socialist Chile and our society have converged on that logic rather than others. Do you think that this is basically something necessitated by industrial society, let's call it, by this mode of production that is also focused on scale and global trade and so on?
Well, three things basically. One, I think that it is necessary if you want to be the biggest and the best. If you want to be on this is the next step of being able to control production and operationalize it effectively to whatever needs you want. Two, I really want to hone in on something you said there that I think was very correct, that like this homogenization, standardization is required in this process, because That is true for machines, but it's also true for people and how these systems have been used. And it's why surveillance of people, of workers by the firm is such an integral part of these cybernetic systems as they've appeared in capitalism. And that part I don't think is necessary in like the overall industrial picture. I think that this is the result of an adversarial relationship between the firm as a capitalist entity and the workers. Whereas in Chile, this was a part of Beer's brilliant design philosophy of he was trying to integrate the worker into production not just as a tool but as an agent, and that he was made the interfaces of Cybersyn as legible as possible, not just to like the managers, but also to the workers who are putting in inputs, because the workers are also inputting information back into the system as a feedback loop. And if you have this adversarial relationship that capitalist firms do, you're going to have a lot of problems that require this overhead surveillance.
Right. This is an interesting point because, these firms often, it's a weird relationship because the legibility is usually in one direction, toward maybe two, toward managers and then toward the consumer as well. Obviously, they're getting access to different kinds of information, but there's this thing where, almost the more a firm is focused on being able to gather the right kinds of information about its organization, the more wary they are about keeping that fairly secretive, at least the top level data. And as you're pointing out, that's not a necessity of how this structure works. Maybe describe a little more, like, what is the idea here behind, the average worker, the average participant or agent in this kind of system also having access to this, like, to the infrastructure of the system here. How would a fully developed version of Beers' version of this be different toward the Amazon version of this?
Well, first I want to highlight like what you just mentioned in terms of the limits of created by the secrecy of the firm, because I think that is very key to what's going on here in our present society. And this is especially true even for institutions as powerful as the Department of Defense, which has like these kind of cybernetic systems internally, and even has at least some feedback with its direct contractors, but it cannot. But that's still limited because of the secrecy of the firm. It's necessarily adversarial relationship to other firms through competition, and it has absolutely no way of getting to information about the supply chain below that, except through publicly available information that journalists are putting out there. One of the things with like Beer's vision and in Cybersyn in general was that fundamental socialist vision of integrating all of production into a common plan that would allow it to unlock some of that potential that's lost by the adversarial relationship. But more, I think, obviously there's something also lost when you don't have that adversarial relationship, don't get me wrong. But there is, within this, like more vertically speaking, in between like workers and managers and stuff like that, there is this, I think you could make a Hayekian critique actually of the way capitalism does things, because workers have this very direct knowledge and information that they're getting by being involved in production the way they are. And usually, because of the adversarial relationship between the firm and workers, and not even beyond that, just the gap between personal knowledge, some of that information is lost because workers aren't integrated as agents into the information that goes into decision making in firms, or are not agents in decision making, and that is something that the Chilean version of socialism tried to hold up, and I think is important in order to make socialism work more generally. If you want, in order to take the cybernetic approach. Now that feedback loop is on one side, but there's also a further feedback loop that you have to think about, and that's with consumers. And this is like what was so important to like the people advocating cybernetic planning as opposed to like the Soviet model, which kind of got left behind because it didn't converge on this issue on the way that it used computer technology. It is this possibility of being able to adjust the plan as you get this new demand information constantly. The Soviet material balancing system was very clunky. You had this plan that you basically had at the beginning of the year. You had to calculate all the inputs and where they would be going. And then as soon as it was created, it was outdated. And if you actually combine cybernetic planning with input-output, which is not what Chile did exactly, but this is one potential way of doing it. And certainly just having that information feedback loop allows you to adjust things in real time that the Soviet system never could.
Basically what's happening here is in the Soviet system, the plan is not adaptable to new information. And so I guess the argument being made here, like tell me if this is correct, is that by opening up, first by just making the system overall more legible, by allowing the average participant, the average worker, to understand how the overall system is working, to be able to receive updates about what other parts of the system are doing. You basically make the whole thing more flexible, and then instead of having this one plan that you just get at the start of the year that instantly becomes outdated, you can both update to match the original plan more, and possibly the plan itself can update as well. Like, is that the general, on the side of like the socialist planners, this is how they're thinking about it? This is the potential?
Is that definitely, that's all a part of it. There was one more thing, I think, with how it's not a big part of the problem of getting information up the chain in the Soviet system was also an adversarial relationship between enterprises and planners. And this kind of more two-way feedback loop is kind of a way to lower that adversarial relationship to get more accurate information from the lower levels, which is also very important to this whole process.
Right. You made a point about competition earlier, and it's making me think of a way of discussing this sort of the approach to like data and how organizations have secrecy that I've always found a little strange. So today, right, I think the version of this that a lot of people are familiar with is open source. It's anti-copyright. It's the idea that, generally speaking, this data that through legal measures we're able to keep monopolistic control over for certain actors, for society to work better. As much data as possible, as much information as possible should be open and accessible to everyone. And, we hear the term like democratization kind of used for this. But obviously what's also happening there is that you're increasing the possible competition that can occur, right? Like it would be fairly hard in a society that had very open data for people to have advantages on the basis of having secrets, basically. And I think this is interesting because from the perspective of this like top level economic planner, it kind of makes sense, right? Because if you're a top level planner, you do not want like particular enterprises or private organizations to be able to maintain secrecy. You want to have the monopoly on decision making power. I guess you delegate this obviously to to people like enterprise managers in this kind of a system, but the buck sort of stops with you. It's presumed that you or the planning committee or whatever, right, have a sort of final say and ownership over the economy overall, and everyone else is kind of operating in something like a commons of information and resources. But I think that what I usually see on the side of especially new companies, right, especially private enterprises where something more real is going on, I'm thinking even in the early 20th century, like things like Edison's labs, it's actually the opposite logic. You want to have a monopoly over your secrets, right? Information that you're privy to. Anything from like the findings from research to maybe information about the industry, like all kinds of information. You want a monopoly over that in order to be able to maximize decision-making control about your operations in the future, right? So there's this conflict between a sort of top-level economic planning entity and a lower-level enterprise, where the enterprise's ability to compete depends on being able to keep secrets, but the planner's ability to actually control the economy depends on the ability to have access to the information across society. And actually, I think that this is kind of you could even have this be like a critique of the Hayekian thing, right? Because Hayek's focuses on markets as ways to transmit information. But I would say for, the largest firms, the ones with the highest level of control, the ones with the most, resources that they control that they can throw into research, they actually have that ability not because of open information, theirs or anyone else's, but because of their own ability to keep secrets. So I kind of want to just lay out that general model of what's going on here. And, my sense is that regardless of whether you have management or workers controlling a particular enterprise, an enterprise that is not able to have secrets is not going to be able to compete and is going to cede its ability to sort of leverage resources into unique things that other enterprises aren't able to compete with them on, right? Where they can take risks without regard to competition because other enterprises do not have the same information they do. I sort of just want to lay that on you, and do you think that that's right, that logic is actually holds regardless of workers or management having control? Or do you think that there's something else going on when these enterprises are under the control of the system Beers wanted?
Well, I think that the system Beers wanted is not just a different relationship between workers and management. It's also when you introduce planners to the system, or you can think of the market as a big planner that in a certain way, and so it's a different relationship also between the enterprise and the planner as well. So you have a kind of a compromise that's made a little bit by having this back and forth. Now, certainly, this has always been this has always been the case to a certain extent, whether it's a Soviet system or if you're a company on the market. Of you're putting information out about yourself in order to sell yourself, in order to get what you want, even if you keep stuff quiet. But I think that in a socialist system, you might it might be less necessary to keep secrets, depending on what the model of your enterprise is. If you want if you're a research lab that's trying to come up with a bunch of stuff, I mean, the Soviets were actually pretty good at coming up with stuff, coming up with inventions and crazy stuff, because they gave smart people a lot of resources to try and figure things out. But what they had a big problem with was putting these inventions and ideas into practice and into production, both to change production but also to create new products or what have you. And part of that was just because the plan was inflexible. It was hard to add new products. But part of it was that managers didn't want to add new products because, or didn't want to change the way that they did things, because it could mean if they make production more efficient, it could mean lower budgets in the future. And one way that some ideas of how to get around this are that you basically run how resources are distributed on an algorithm. And you can even run algorithms without having computers and stuff. You just have a set of rules that are followed that although computers allow you to do it more automatically, of adjusting production to meet demand. For example, if you have labor tokens, I mean, this all gets into a bit more complicated stuff. But essentially, if like the resources going into a good is outweighing its social demand, it can be redistributed and that kind of stuff, and you do that on an automatic level. But there are other ways in more general to discipline production to make it more efficient. And cybernetics offers a way to do that through like doing things in an automatic way and making it a part of the system as a whole, in things that enterprises like have to interact with, like in a way that's like analogous to money, but but in markets, but kind of in operating on certain different principles.
So my sense is that the way that information works in practice, we've been using terms like information and data so far in this discussion, but that's actually pretty abstract, and that's, apart from things like lot numbers, say, that's mostly not the data that's important for the sort of the bigger picture operations of what organizations are doing. So I'm thinking here about what you said about, Soviets are able to give resources to inventors, but even when they achieve something, there's no incentive to adapt them. And it seems like one of the major differences with the American or the sort of broadly Western capitalist system, and the Chinese iteration of that system, the German system, is that there's a tight interaction between organizations working on some problem and them also putting research into finding ways to improve that process, right? So, I mean, this is sort of an abstract way of saying it, but, you look at Amazon, they're working with different digital platforms. They create those digital platforms internally in order to make their processes in warehouses easier, their overall logistical systems more efficient, and then they also use a lot of those platforms as products in their own right, and so they kind of take information from the market by selling them, right, by people outside the company using these platforms, and then they're able to kind of integrate that back and keep their internal infrastructure more disciplined and more efficient. In the German system, like you see this with engineering, with sort of hardware technologies, you have companies going to universities, and the government does play a role, right? There is a sort of more explicit economic planning. Funding is allocated for research, but the research is being done by people working actively in the field. And what usually happens is that those results get leveraged back into companies. Often the actual researchers will go back to the companies that they worked for with the results of that research and apply it. And, there's kind of just an understanding that you're leveraging public goods like access to information or access to research facilities also in that situation. But the sort of the practice of the thing and this this kind of ability to act on information and do research, those are very integrated. Whereas it seems like in what's happening in the Soviet system is that they're not really that integrated, right? And I guess I wonder how in the Beers model of doing this, that would have been fixed. Like, it doesn't seem to necessarily be the case that a planner is going to be more willing to cut budgets, for enterprises that could be more efficient, to force them to be more efficient. Like, that's a political relationship, right? That's something that can very easily be acting on something completely different from the economic logic of the enterprise. So, like, I guess my question here is, like, what is the political culture then informing who acts on this information and how and why, right? That seems to be what determines a lot of the failures and successes of these systems.
So I think that it's important to think about cybernetic planning not necessarily as a bunch of, like, obviously at some points there will be political interventions, just like there is even in the capitalist system in production. But a lot of the planning that's going on in cybernetic planning isn't necessarily like a bunch of people coming together and deciding how much budgets are going to be. I mean, Chile still had money and markets going on, and there were like money going into enterprise and stuff. One of the main models for socialist cybernetic production is one introduced by Paul Kochut and Alan Cottrell in their book Towards a New Socialism, that like they have this idea of running an algorithm that, like I mentioned before, is basically there's an end market for goods that gives you an idea of demand, and if you make products that are more in demand, you get more resources allocated to you automatically within the budget, and when you have this kind of incentive structure that you actually are getting more resources when you produce things that things want, well, now you suddenly have an incentive to make things more efficient. You want to bring in these new processes and ideas into your enterprise and integrate them into production, and you want to make things that are more desirable in general. And that's kind of the idea behind it. That incentives do matter, and that's a basic thing about economics, regardless of what mode of production you're in.
So then what ultimately makes this system differ from something like, worker-owned cooperative plus market economy between cooperatives, right? Like, if the idea here is something like worker control plus access to information, I mean, I guess you could argue that theoretically the cybernetic system or something is even more efficient than things like price signals. But is that the difference, or is there something even more fundamentally different in Beers's logic of what's going on here?
The difference is it kind of comes down to what we talk about, the bullwhip effect, in that when you have, like, in such a situation where you have a full cybernetic socialist society, the only market that exists is really for final goods. Everything else, once you know what the demand is for a good, you can adjust all of production through like cybernetic information feedback loops. You no longer have to rely on market price signals to do so. And there's also, I mean, because of the way markets work, there are more fundamental things that go on in differences in society. So one thing that this branch of economics called classical econophysics has discovered, which is kind of applying, like the idea of this is applying the mathematics of an ideal gas and all those kinds of more statistical mechanics stuff into economics, is that when you have a market, you have a necessarily a exponential, or rather I should say you have a entropy maximized distribution of income in the economy because of the way that market interactions work. Even if you just assume that people are making random kind of decisions about like you can't know what people want if you just assume that like they could want anything and they just have these exchanges randomly, then they'll have this incredibly unequal distribution of income. that's a result of market production, even if you don't have a capitalist class. When you have a capitalist class, you actually have a bimodal distribution of income in society, and the far end, the capitalist end, is much more steep and unequal.
Sorry, so your point there about entropy, can you just explain a little more, like what is the equivalent phenomenon in production that we're referring to here, or in economic decision making?
Well, this is right. So this point about entropy is a point about market exchange. We should think about more generally. I think we do need to think about economics and economic production in terms of entropy and statistical mechanics and that kind of things, because fundamentally what we're doing in production is decreasing entropy inside the firm. Basically, we're trying to organize things in a certain way that creating all of these identical goods or changing like the very maximized entropy of the natural world into. No, I don't. I wouldn't quite say so, but I would say, like obviously we bring our own like judgments about like what these things mean on a normative level. I know that there have been right wingers who say that, oh, because market exchange maximizes entropy of income, this is a natural phenomenon and we shouldn't be concerned about it. But I don't think that's the case. It's because if you don't have market exchange, obviously you don't have a maximized entropy income distribution. It just didn't exist before general commodity markets came into being. So I think that I mean this is just all to say that there will be big differences between a cybernetically planned society and a society that is still like lacks a capitalist class but operates off of markets, or even includes capital markets and the intermediary markets.
But so I still think we're a little unclear here on what the phenomenon we are referring to with entropy here is. So maybe like give me an illustrative example here. You know, what's an example of like a very high entropy income distribution economy? What's causing that? And then what does a low entropy company look like? It sounds like you're saying that it's usually on the company level that this gets lowered and that production becomes mastered.
So I think there actually is an analogous way to think about this, in that if you think about like biology, right? In order to living beings lower entropy, we have to maintain this kind of homeostasis, and it creates work in order to survive. But how living beings evolve in interacting with their environment is an entropy maximizing process. In capitalism, firms are kind of like these living beings, and the market is how they is the entropy maximizing process that determines how they change over time, which is kind of the role evolution plays for ordinary beings, creating adaptations. And that's how that correlation comes into being.
Right, like companies are, I mean, you can argue there's like a selection effect on companies, where the ones that best use their resources and circumstances are the ones that are going to survive at any given point in time, or be dominant at any given point in time.
Right. And in capitalism, this, like, because the information of how firms are made to adapt to like the larger conditions is expressed in money. It also determines whether you get to eat or not, and that's kind of the big problem that socialists have. And that this information in a socialist system would be expressed as actual pure information of ones and zeros of within like the cybernetic planning system.
I guess my issue, and this kind of extends to the this application of scientific modeling and terminology to a lot of economic activity, is that I'm basically increasingly convinced that it strips the texture that actually matters off of a lot of what's going on here, like to the point where you could arguably be suspicious of a lot of these top level, even normal economic measurements. Obviously, things like criticism of GDP, these are things I think most people are familiar with at this point. The idea that doesn't actually get to the level of what's going on economically, but I think you could even apply to aspects of this large scale industrial logistical system that we're talking about, right? So, there's this kind of like brute Fordism that we could talk about going on here, where you just kind of like try and maximize the scale gains over and over again, and kind of strip waste out as much as possible. But then you actually look at, this is an example I've given before in this podcast, but you look at like the Toyota and Taiichi Ono interpretation of Fordism, and one of the things they always say is that the whole point here is to actually increase control of workers and participants over the system that they're working on, right? And so in that system, the individual worker is actually completing multiple tasks on the production line, not just a single task like in the sort of, traditional Fordist model that people talk about. And so there's this understanding, and I don't think it's an accident that a lot of these guys are not coming out of like, what we are now business administration programs or economics. They're coming out of actually working on shop floors in various industries, right? They understand the production process is like very tightly linked to achieving production of certain kinds of goods or to certain goals. And what I see in this kind of the logic of this logistical system is that you basically have all these very embedded processes turned into like brute data, basically. And my concern with this is that I suspect that this may actually be extremely harmful to the industrial process. And, kind of regardless, I don't quite know how shifting the role of workers in this process impacts this. But certainly with managers who are already a step removed most of the time, or multiple steps removed from the production process, and if you're in the logistics side, right, if you're doing what Amazon is doing and delivering things, you're not even in the production process per se. You're kind of like, you have this super powerful entity that is basically able to leverage the power that it has over delivery, over this form of logistics, to now get involved in production. But basically, like you have entities that are not involved in a hard production process that are now becoming kind of the main component, and like the main forces of economic power in our society. And that delinking, like the disembodiment from actual production and turning production into just data, like regardless of that, of whether that's Cybersyn or Amazon, that to me seems to be actually very dangerous for industrial society. And I don't know if what we've laid out here, like the kind of more worker-friendly model of this or whatever, actually solves that problem. So I'd like to hear what you have to say on this topic.
Well, I think that, for one, to address the kind of idea of resiliency and the problem of being like too efficient, which I do think is a problem, I think that regardless of what kind of system you want, you need information about and inventory management controls, especially, which is a big part of all this, in order to build resiliency. And you can see this, for example, with the War Stopper program, for example, that DoD runs, which ran government stockpiles of all kinds of equipment, including like N95 masks. And it ran the stockpile by making a contract with industry that they would basically, like the manufacturers would maintain big warehouses full of this stuff in the quantities that they forecasted they might need, and and rotate that stockpile with consumer demand. So if you want to build these buffers and that kind of stuff, you still need to know what's going on. And in a society that doesn't have that kind of information cannot even begin to build the kind of real resiliency to respond to shocks, except by just letting a bunch of stuff explode and then rebuild afterwards. And certainly sometimes letting that kind of creative destruction is necessary, but on certain things, like in pandemics or war or all kinds of eventualities, you really need that kind of information and resiliency.
But that's true, but that information, there's a form of this information that is very tightly linked to some actual productive process. And then there's forms that are kind of like just these weird, abstract spirit forms of a market, right? And let me make a comparison here. Amazon, a lot of how Amazon operates on the platforms that most people are using is what we have here as a marketplace. Amazon is now providing goods of its own, but, for most of its history, you had merchants using Amazon and you had consumers using Amazon. And what Amazon was able to do was build this extremely powerful platform for delivery, for matching consumers to buyers, for giving prices, et cetera, right? But basically the functions of a market were what Amazon was integrating into its system. Let me give a different example here, right? Apple, when Apple is making the iPhone, it goes to Samsung and it goes to Taiwan Semiconductor, and it places these huge orders, right? And this famously puts it puts Taiwan at the cutting edge of the semiconductor industry, and it allows Samsung to become like the leading maker of smartphones, basically, of that hardware. And, I'm sure within that system, they're using a lot of careful logistical management and tracking, right? I mean, you have to when you're operating and producing that kind of scale. But in this case, what you have is like, it's a logistical system planning within the company, right? It's more real economic planning in a sense, right? In the sense that all of these systems are very tightly linked to achieve a certain production goal. Whereas in the Amazon case, what you have going on is legibility that's kind of being used to like capture value from people using a digital marketplace of some kind, right? And those seem to me to be very different applications of this, right? It's like, are producers changing their operations to suit the logic of a market, or vice versa? Is this logistical system operating and getting disciplined by the logic that a producer has, even a large producer like Samsung? And that seems to me to be like a very important difference here. And I mean, maybe this is a good time to talk about the sort of Amazon unionization example. I don't see how Amazon, unionizing, let's take the really radical version of this. Like, let's just say Amazon were to become somehow completely worker controlled. The logic of what Amazon is doing doesn't seem to change. So I would like to hear, describe to me what actually changes in this scenario where the workers at Amazon or in any company like Amazon are more empowered in the infrastructure they're working on.
Well, I think that in order to become really empowered, it would require certain changes in how they do things. But I think that even unionizing as they are will have a very large impact to rationalize production within warehouses and make the automated systems actually a lot more effective by having some input and buy-in from workers.
But it seems like the problem here is that the systems are the systems can become more effective, but they're already built to basically allow the company that sort of owns the market it literally owns like these digital marketplaces, and its job is to capture value from those operating on them. And who knows, maybe economically that doesn't actually matter that much for a lot of normal consumer goods, because it's not like anyone really has monopolies over them anyway. And maybe Amazon capturing that value and being able to leverage into something else or some kind of research or whatever, maybe that's good somehow. But I sort of haven't seen that argument made at any point. So I guess that's what I'm getting at here. Like, what is the fundamental logic of Amazon that's going to change in the case where workers are empowered in it, as opposed to like, things might just become a bit more efficient here and there?
Well, I mean, part of this is, you can hardly blame Amazon for taking advantage of this market. In order, if you really wanted to have a different model for Amazon, you have to, either they have to get into a different business, or we have to really change our economic system as a whole, rather than just Amazon. But I think that if workers were in control of Amazon, we would see different management decisions probably, and but all of that would still be constrained within a market, so long as we do have our economic system as it is today. There's something to be said about market discipline and the role that it plays even for large companies. But there are all kinds of discipline that you can apply to enterprises, not just market discipline. Sometimes market discipline can produce very undesirable results, depending on what the situation is.
Right. Well, look, let me frame it this way. I think that there's something that happens with the sort of the worker control instinct, where we stop actually thinking about what production is. And Marx, to my understanding, when Marx is laying out with the industries that he sees as productive, things like transport and delivery, and even government itself, he does not see these things as value producers, right? He sees them as like sort of, they might be necessary in some sense, but they're capturing a part of the value that is actually produced. They're extractive in some way. And so there's this weird, I don't know if it's a contradiction, but maybe it's just like failure to think about the question of like, where does the value actually come from? If you have this really, really powerful like logistical delivery organization like, say, FedEx, but that organization is not actually responsible for generating value in society, then even if you're taking like this a Marxist perspective on it, it doesn't seem like worker control over that necessarily solves a lot of the more fundamental problems. Like, do you think that's correct? Because it seems like okay.
Yeah, I think that is correct. I think that's correct. I think that the only way to really get around that is to get information not just on a specific firm, but on build information feedback networks for the entire economy, and even maybe the global economy to a certain extent. You need this is if you have information from raw materials all the way up the supply chain, you make it possible to really understand how value is created, where like what, I mean, you can literally run input-output tables for entire economies that tell you if we have more, like 10 tons more of wood and steel in this, what more other things could we produce? And that's the power of
right. What's
of
interesting
cybernetic
about
planning.
that is that it's a lot more real again than I think a lot of the numbers we're using. I think a lot of people, you study economics, you have this experience of looking at a report from the 1950s where people are describing like this year in Russia they produced 40 million pairs of shoes, and in America they produced this many million pairs of shoes. And in Russia, they produced, this many loaves of bread, and in America, they produced this many loaves of bread. And like the implication for a lot of people is that this is a very clunky way of measuring production. But I sort of disagree with that. I actually think that this is way more, way more real, and because you're actually looking at what is being made and what inputs are going into it, and then presumably, what kind of labor is being put into it as well, right? I mean, that is the real process of production. And these, any value judgments about what should be getting produced are downstream of actually having a sense of what that capacity is. So yeah, I definitely agree. Like that view of how an economy is working seems way more accurate.
Yeah, I think you're right on the ball there. I think that it even allows us to make certain trade-offs that are very difficult to make right now, and that we kind of have to play by ear. That because the principal budget, when you're not dealing with money, is labor hours. Because you can that tells you how many natural resources you can yield, how much everything else you can have, and it's the most direct trade-off in economics of how much free time do you want versus how much stuff do you want, and you can. With enough information about how production works, you can make that trade-off in a very somewhat precise manner.
It's and I mean this is like where I think it actually does get important to talk about what is the relationship to a particular or of a particular worker or manufacturer to the system that they're working in, over which this kind of very advanced logistical network is overlaid and which it's assisting. That's why I think it is important to look at that, like what is the fundamental thing doing. That said, I do, let's we've kind of discussed like it seems like you can't just conflate the different productive processes here. You need to look at them, but let's look at the let's assume that some section of our economic production is actually helped and assisted by this kind of advanced logistical framework, this very legible data generating framework. Then there's this question of the worker relation to it, and I kind of would like to hear you talk a bit more about that, and maybe what does it do to the, we could call it like the economic culture, to the culture of production. Like in the current model, we see workers as these extremely disciplined objects within the production process, right? Like they're monitored in the delivery trucks, and it's very physically demanding, it's physically draining, it's psychologically draining. The worker is sort of actively disempowered in the process because the priority is to make sure the process overall is very predictable. But it sounds like you think that there's a version of this which is more, it kind of empowers worker agency and the agency of a participant more. Maybe just describe more why would that happen? How would that actually improve the logic of how this thing is working?
Right. So I think that it's not just possible. I think it's also would be a marked improvement in terms of the efficiency of such a system. Just because, like one, as we discussed, workers have access to information about production that management doesn't necessarily have, and two, it's right now there's that adversarial relationship which has to be overcome through surveillance systems at a certain expense. So I think that without those things, if you have a system that actually integrates workers into these feedback loops, which gives them a actual power to determine how they're making things in what manner, that this would be an incredibly agile system of production. Because right now, if and I certainly know this from my experience in the workplace, and I think this is a lot of other people's experience. If you're a worker that just takes down orders from people, you are necessarily not using your imagination a lot. You're just waiting to be told what to do. And this is actively encouraged in a lot of ways. If you empower workers, like as cliche as it might sound, to use their imagination to solve problems and stuff like that, you can actually make production a lot more agile and capable of meeting all kinds of different needs. Because workers are not just like tools that can be used in a very mechanical fashion. They are general intelligences who can be taught to do all kinds of things and also figure out things sometimes. And this is kind of also like the military, like the U.S. military doctrine is and this has been a development over military history for a long time, that when you have when you make small groups of soldiers able to think and act on their own, that's actually a very powerful fighting force. And it's a big problem of why Russia, for example, is having so many problems in Ukraine, because they don't have that kind of system. They have a command control system where they tell workers what to do and don't really aren't trained to use their heads really. And that's kind of one of the big differences.
But so then it sounds like the argument here is that this kind of empowerment actually increases the functionality and the production, presumably, of the system overall. However, that seems to be aligned to the interests of managers and owners of the systems that currently exist. So then why does this not happen? Why do we have this like hyper-disciplining system that we do have?
I mean, you can see it with Amazon right now why it doesn't happen. Because if you give workers too much power and agency, they and I mean, it happens even if, I mean, it's a natural consequence just putting them all together in one place, really. Is it though?
Well, but the grievances, right, in the Amazon unionization thing is exactly the kind of abuses we're talking about, right? Like the maybe the dysfunctionality of the system and how they're experiencing it. But your argument seems to be that if the system were functioning proper, like a properly functioning system where both those grievances are addressed and overcome and the production functionality increases, it seems like the long-term interests are aligned there. So, I mean, I certainly agree that the conflicts come out of that in the short term, but why, like, if those interests are aligned, then theoretically it seems like we could imagine that even without any kind of worker initiative, the owners and managers would update the system because it works better for them. Why does this not happen? So there's a trade-off. It sounds like there's a trade-off between this overall functionality of the system versus the power differentials between owners and management and labor. Is that correct? Like, is that the argument? Okay, yeah. So I mean, yeah, this is obviously like I'd say a pretty like classical Marxist analysis of what's going on there. I mean, I sort of, I don't know if I entirely agree with it, in the sense that, like, it suggests a poor ability of management to condition what the interests of workers that they perceive are, that, like, we know isn't the only option. I mean, so, like, in the German model, right, where you have these, like, more family-owned companies, I mean, you even do have unions, right? You do have a fairly high degree of unionization in these traditional hard manufacturing industries. But my sense is that, like, the culture is simply not as adversarial. I mean, you know, maybe like in the Marxist lens, it's still kind of like there's this inherent adversarialness that's kind of getting toned down or restricted in different ways, which, like, be that as it may, I mean, obviously, even on the individual level, there's like a mixed dynamic of adversarialness and collaboration between any worker and any manager, and that can vary a huge amount. But we, you know, it is possible, in fact, for companies to condition not just the like physical production, but also, I think, the culture and interest that employees perceive. You know, this is obviously a different industry, but I think of, like, Costco here, where you generally see reported, like, a high level of collaboration from workers and a high level of satisfaction, even if there are these other, like, you know, somewhat inbuilt adversarial tendencies that you have to manage. In the Amazon case, it's like that has accelerated, right? The level of adversarialness we're seeing there, and in companies like Walmart, and like the big players of this logistical system, are ramped up to a far higher extent that we have in a lot of other industries and that we see in a lot of other countries. So it seems like at least part of this is not just this inherent divide between workers and owners and managers, right? There's something additional or something accelerating that beyond what's inbuilt. And, you know, I'm interested to hear what you think is going on there.
Well, I mean, a lot of these Amazon, Walmart, and these kinds of systems are also kind of on the cutting edge of what kind of efficiency you can get out of these systems, and trying to, and a part of that is trying to force workers to move as, like, fast as possible to keep the pace with the machines, and basically to exploit them as much as possible. And that's what you have to do if you want to be the best capitalist. And you can be a not as good capitalist and kind of come to some kind of agreement. But if you want to be the best, you have to exploit. And if you want to have that kind of labor input, that's not going to come about from that kind of mentality or situation. It's going to come about through struggle and back and forth. And it's even then, I think we've discussed what, like, the limits of what Amazon is capable of as a single firm in our society. I do think that you have to think about a whole distribution of possibilities in I mean, there's all different kinds of firms out there with different kinds of approaches to production and their own strategies for succeeding. And some of them will take lower profit rates and a certain kind of stability, and others want really high profit rates. And if you want to do that and you're in a competitive industry, the only way to do that is to exploit your employees as much as possible.
So you said something interesting there, which is that, correct me if this wasn't quite what you meant, but it sounds like you're of the view that, you know, we're like the Walmarts and Amazons and so on, they're actually kind of at the edge of increasing efficiencies in, like, the system as it exists right now at the technological level. I mean, you know, obviously we're seeing, like, there's clearly been some kind of massive meltdown in, like, the FedEx infrastructure in the past few years. there you have like these compounding errors all rippling out from the shipping crisis. So we do see this top level breakdown, but is that kind of what like, are you talking about this more situational or circumstantial maxing out, or do you actually think that we've reached like the limits of this system as it currently exists?
I think we're close to the limits. I think that there's a big difference between firms like Amazon and Walmart and firms like FedEx, because Amazon, like these are the big cybernetic giants, have much more general capabilities of what they can do, and because of like I think because of those cybernetic capabilities, and a big part of the problem. I mean, there are certain advantages to having like workers having inputs and having a certain stability. Like UPS, I think, is heavily unionized in the industry and has not had the problems that FedEx has. I think it's UPS. But at the same time, UPS and FedEx are only UPS and FedEx. They aren't dynamic, really like cutting edge.
Sure, companies. They don't have the maneuverability of a company like Amazon or
right.
Walmart. But I mean, this is a pretty interesting prediction. Then, let me ask it like this, right? Because we touched earlier on this weird cultural dynamic of maximizing or overhyping the possibilities of automation and like weirdly hiding the human role that exists in a lot of this, and I don't quite know what the incentive for that is, but one theory is obviously that we have to, for any company to stay successful, you have to be able to predict increasing efficiency and increasing production. And for this kind of company, that means, making the overall operation more efficient and functional. If we take the view that actually, like, internally people are maxing out the functionality of these things in ways that just, automating or optimizing like another part of the chain isn't going to fix, because you've actually run the human component to the ground. That seems like quite like that's a crisis level situation almost, given how central these organizations are to our economy now, and even to, like, increasingly to the political power structure. So I'd like to hear just you elaborate on what do you think is going to happen there. Like, if we're assuming that these companies, the people controlling this infrastructure, have maxed out its development for now, what is the ultimate fate of that? Like, is there a decline? Is there a conflict? Do we have to like break into some new logic here for this to work?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that, and I kind of hinted at this in the article, of that we really do need to expand those feedback loops to include workers at some point. And this, if it comes about in the West, it'll be because of like the Amazon union and the struggles going on there. But I think that like one of the big problems, to go with what you said about like trying to hide the human in all this, I think it comes down to the fact that there's an extra layer of coordinating information that is very distorted in capitalist societies, and that's capital markets, which do not behave the way that normal price signals do, and have like are very related to appearances and those kinds of things, of trying to convince people with lots of money and with basically trying to target that very high end of the income of where money is flowing in society to get more resources. And the way to do that is through controlling your appearances in a very particular way. That the outputs matter much less in the capital market in a material way.
I want to touch on a final thing here before we wrap up. We're kind of getting to the end of this podcast. asked you earlier about the political culture side of this, and let's, for the moment, lean into the idea that it is in fact possible for this system to become more directly informed and controlled by how it functions to further the ends of workers actively involved in, some kind of process of labor in this system, instead of like just having the workers be disciplined as objects in that system. One of the things we talked about when this piece was being written was this kind of you could think of it as like almost the Athenian model. So, for those listening, one of the traits of the Athenian political system was that it was expected for workers to be able, or sorry, not workers, citizens. It was expected for Athenian citizens to be able to perform various roles within the state. And, citizens could be chosen by lot to fulfill certain functions. So it was this very highly active and participatory form of politics and of running the Athenian state, where instead of having a person highly specialized, they had to be able to take on at least a few different roles, and a citizen could be expected to perform different roles through their lives. And, in the process of work, I mentioned earlier, some of the 20th century industrialists, in fact, saw this process as something that was meant to actually ultimately restore like a wide breadth of control and possibility for how workers interacted with the system. What does the culture of work become in a system where you actually have this wide access to information and to different parts of the chain of production as an individual laboring within that system?
I think it should emulate kind of that Athenian model of being able to take on those different roles, of being someone who's not just like a good person making the heads of nails or something, or whatever your particular role is, but being able to understand what's going on, to imagine the possibilities of what you're doing and how things could be different because you understand what it is. And and this is also very closely related to a proposal that was in towards a new socialism, the book on cybernetic planning by Koksha and Cottrell, that there should be executive managers or people or committees that are like boards of supervisors or boards of running companies today that are basically chosen by lots, and that you as an individual should be expected to have the responsibility to run things sometimes, and that this is like every Athenian could be expected to serve in politics at some point or another, and that ordinary workers in this kind of democratic vision should be able to maybe making executive decisions too occasionally. And that's kind of the democratic spirit behind it.
So, to take that Athenian example, one of the arguments that got made by a lot of the classical political thinkers of that time was that that level of trust within the state and of ability to call on people also required fairly small states, right? Small republics, small democracies. If we're going to stretch this metaphor, the nature of this system is that it is not small, right? It functions, it captures the value that it does because of the scale and the number of people involved in this. Doesn't that basically forestall, because let's imagine this kind of lot process for workers. It's usually, even with general worker professionalism and so on, it's usually not the case that you can kind of put random people in charge of things and the whole operation will work as it did before better. There are actual relationships usually at play here, right? There are relationships built up. People prove their ability to lead. There's a bunch of like tacit knowledge that gets built up when you've been working on a small team for a long time, ways of doing things that you can't just kind of replicate into a manual. Doesn't that conflict with the scale logic that's operating in these systems?
Certainly, you'll never be able to get rid of experts and specialists, even in the most democratic societies, in the most democratic industrial societies. If you're like hunter-gatherers, you don't need specialists. But and these people, like specialists and experts, play certainly important roles. You might still need economists to be looking at the budgets that are coming out, and playing a role in creating them. But I think that this kind of idea of democracy by lots would still operate on that smaller scale of like the enterprise, the division that runs in a certain city or the certain branch of production, like that might involve, I don't know, 10 to 40,000 people, or maybe even 100,000 people. That's kind of close to the size of Athens. You might have a lot of like stuff chosen in that kind of random way. But on a larger scale, the fact that you have these like cybernetic feedback networks does mean that you are capable of a lot more direct democracy, of directly voting on proposals and that kind of things. I think the pirate parties in Europe make a big deal about this, that we have the technology to do this, but we never really use it for anything. And maybe there's potential there. And certainly there's no set way of going about this. Maybe like the Chinese are pretty smart about how they trial and error things and try things on a small scale and to expand them. So maybe like there's different kinds of ways of doing this that may be appropriate.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'm interested in is what that does to the idea of ownership in the functional sense. Like, I'm sort of less interested in here in the formal legal ownership question, but I mean ownership in the sense of control and investment within an institution, such that like you feel confident that you're taking on you're sharing in the risks and in the rewards of that institution's performance, and you know, to the extent that someone has control in an institution actively, they do end up forming, I think, a closer relationship with it. But on the other hand, you know, the tendency in our society, and I think this is true of the Walmarts and Amazons as well, they in fact drive this. You know, for most workers, they do not have any such relationship toward an institution. Any job that they have within the organization is obviously going to be short term. There's pretty much, you know, most people in it are never going to see that much promotion beyond maybe 1 or 2 levels. And in fact, you know, there's obviously hard bottlenecks as you get up the chain by necessity. And so the structure is built up to kind of to minimize ownership in that functional sense for most people. On the other hand, like it you know, the culture you're talking about, it theoretically, I could see it increasing that functional ownership. You know, I'm reminded of Wolf, our editor-in-chief. You know, he has this take that like Elon Musk is fundamentally a proletarian because despite owning SpaceX and Tesla and so on, he also like sleeps on the shop floor and is you know, very to like the micromanagerial level involved in like the day-to-day processes in a lot of those companies. And so the relationship starts like blurring these lines between owner and active worker participant in the system. But you know, regardless of like where the coin falls on that, it seems like if you have that level of like a real sense of ownership over the process, you should start to see things like a decrease in things like job hopping through one's life, I would think. And
I would agree with
because,
that.
Yeah, what you would have is basically like like if you have a sense of ownership over an institution sufficiently large, then that would transfer presumably into a much longer term relationship than we see for most workers today, because the incentives are just different, the relationship is different. So maybe you're saying you agree with that. I'd be interested to hear, like, elaborate on that. Maybe if you want to talk about what other cultural changes would you see shifting in a system like this?
I definitely think that people would grow more attachment to their work, to their enterprise, and that for people who do want to take ownership, who have some kind of innate leadership capability or learn how to have it, that there's a potential to take ownership of a program or an enterprise, in the sense that you're making decisions, people listen to you, you're allocating resources to try something new or change the way that things work a little bit. And that these things happen even in the most bureaucratic kind of like stifled environment, and like the people can take ownership. And actually, in certain ways, in bureaucratic systems, there's a big potential for it, because a lot of like ordinary people don't particularly care. So if you have that incentive, you can make a big difference. I think that the culture would be there would certainly be a lot more sense of responsibility, I think, over what happens if like there is this genuine feedback loop, because now you can see consequences for your decisions, and you can see like what potential there is. I think that people might actually get more emotional about it, for better or for worse. And I think that that they would also, I think it might even be reflected in our media, in our writing, of people like work dramas suddenly taking on much greater meaning and have impact of like of not just personal relationships, but how people change the world.
Right. Yeah. That's an interesting point, actually. I think that in some ways is the most interesting part of this piece for me, like thinking about those possibilities, because, I think obviously a lot of people, I mean, we're seeing it right now with all the resignations from jobs and stuff, and the sort of like perma work at home thing. I mean, I'm skeptical that that's actually a sustainable thing, and I think it's largely undesirable. But to the way that that's changed like work culture even more, there's this like complete disassociation of any kind of real, like having a real relationship to the work that you do, and the nature of how our economy is structured and what kinds of organizations are powerful in it, I think accelerates that. I think there's a temptation for a lot of people to, either they drop out or they kind of fantasize about like, return to traditional artisan craftsmanship or what have you. And like, obviously I see the attraction to a lot of that, but I tend to think that the actual problem that has to be resolved here is, how do you reconcile that ownership and actual control and participation to the industrial process? Because I think it existed. I think that the actually transformative periods of industrial society have actually had more of that kind of relationship, particularly with some of the most well-known industrialists, and with the kind of workshops and laboratories that existed in those periods. And I think we either figure out how to actually reconcile that in some new way, like maybe we have to push the industrial logic further in ways we don't quite know yet. But I think if we don't do this, then we're kind of in danger of the thing just like grinding society down, because I don't think we are reversing the industrial process here. We have to figure out how to push it into a more vital direction, or we're going to be fairly badly damaged by its stagnation. And I mean, Samo Boria wrote a piece for us arguing this, that after, if we have significant enough industrial collapse, we may actually just not begin the process again, because it depended on such a high level of different things converging in history that you can't just replicate it suddenly. You can't just bring it back once it's in a high level of stagnation. So I think your piece, in that sense, was a very interesting argument and thought experiment.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, I think we'll wrap it up there for now. Again, we've been talking to Nicolas Villarreal. The piece we've been discussing is on the website. It's called How Capitalist Giants Use Socialist Cybernetic Planning, and is also available in Palladium 5. So we'll be continuing a couple more of these episodes with Palladium 5 authors. And again, if you're interested in signing up and receiving 4 times a year our print edition of Palladium, you can go to palladiummag.com/subscribe and sign up there or get more info. That's it for now. Thanks, Nico, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Cool. And we'll see you guys soon. Bye-bye for now.